Hey guys, tonight we're cracking open a candlelit ledger from a forgotten room in the grand city of Constantinople. You're sitting cross-legged on a rough wool mat, the room thick with the scent of lamp oil and old ink, as a junior scribe tries to straighten his back for the third time this hour. A clay cup of watered-down wine is slowly losing its will to be drinkable, and outside you can hear a mule braying somewhere near the seawall, but inside it's quieter. You're surrounded by stacks of parchment, some freshly dried, others so fragile they wheeze when you touch them. You poor thing have been assigned to copy tax documents until sunrise, and this is just your first week. You'll be lucky if your eyesight lasts the month. The ink smells weird. Your back's already hunched like a nervous bishop, and the candles dripping wax dangerously close to your only tunic. Honestly, you probably won't survive this, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment with where you're watching from, and what time it is, hopefully not during your own night shift. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You sit in the quiet hum of midnight Constantinople, a city that smells like incense fish and melted copper. Outside the palace glows faintly, and somewhere deep inside its archives are miles and miles of tax records, literally. The Byzantine bureaucracy, bless its gold-threaded sandals, was obsessed with record-keeping. Think the IRS, but with more saints' swords and sudden disappearances. Tonight, you've been volunteered by your boss, an anxious eunuch named Nikitas with a stammer and a suspiciously well-fed pigeon, to sort through records from the Western Anatolican district. They're not even that old, just from 3 emperors ago. You hold a parchment up to the candlelight and squint at the looped Greek script. It's a tax roll from a village that's probably underwater by now. Possibly also on fire. Taxes in the Byzantine Empire weren't just about numbers. They were a ritual, a civic, spiritual, and political dance, with steps no one remembered and penalties no one forgot. This document in your hand, it's not just ink and parchment. It's a person's life in financial shorthand. Goats, olives, children, and unpaid levies. The record begins with a name, Stephanos, son of Makarios. He owns 2 oxen and half a vineyard. Apparently his cousin Theodora also lives with him and owes 4 solidi in back taxes. You pause. There's a small ink blot next to her name, and a passive-aggressive note from a tax collector said she was praying too loudly to be heard. You sigh. This job was part archival, part detective work, and part masochism. You think about asking for a promotion to Night Owl Revenue Analyst, just for the title. But in truth, the real work was done long before the ink hit the scroll. Taxation in the empire started at the top, literally. Emperors sitting beneath gilded ceilings and pious mosaics approved annual fiscal projections. The big number trickled downward like watered wine, sloshing through the ministries into diocesan offices, then on to the provincial tax administrators. These were the folks who sent squads of scribes to villages like Stephanos's and demanded they list everything from livestock to sons-in-law. You stretch your aching hand and grab the next parchment. This one is a catagraphon, a comprehensive list of taxable items in a given area. You'd expect grain and sheep. Instead, it includes 2 bathtubs, 3 geese trained to honk at strangers, and a donkey that sometimes sings. You wonder how they even taxed that. Still, these records are vital. See, the Byzantine Empire didn't rely solely on taxing income, it taxed ownership. If you had land, you paid land tax Georgikon telos. If you owned a shop, you paid commercial tax. And if you simply existed, congratulations, the capitatio or head tax had you covered. What's wild is how seriously the scribes took their work. Historians still argue whether Byzantine tax clerks were true civil servants or just glorified paper hoarders with control issues. Either way, their obsession with detail rivals your friend, who still alphabetizes their spice rack. As you dip your pen into fresh ink, your mind wanders to the way taxes were enforced. There weren't always jails or courts involved. Often a household that couldn't pay might find itself saddled with a coercion debt. Basically, someone else, usually a richer neighbor or distant cousin, was assigned to pay for them. The relationship didn't always survive. You find one parchment labeled Civic Penalties Spring Collection. A farmer named Ioannes tried to claim his neighbor's pig as a religious sacrifice to avoid taxation. There's a note. The pig was not sufficiently divine. Full taxes applied. The Byzantine legal system often blurred the line between earthly and heavenly matters. Priests sometimes accompanied tax collectors to ensure fairness or to help guilt stubborn villagers into compliance. And always there was a paper trail. One you now have to copy by candlelight. Your fingers are numb, and the candle's flicker is looking suspiciously like a hallucination of Saint Basil waving at you. But there's no stopping yet. The empire runs on taxes, and taxes run on people like you. People hunched in small rooms with neck cramps, and a highly dubious bladder schedule. You pause and glance at your ink-stained hands. Funny how the fate of a vast empire with golden gates and holy wars came down to whether Stephanos could afford a replacement ox this year, or whether someone correctly documented those geese with anger issues. The longer you stare at the records, the more real these long-gone lives become. The little notes, the hasty corrections, the occasional doodle in the margins, a sword, a fish, a disgruntled goat. Maybe some things never change. You finally set your quill down. One scroll copied, 1,000 more to go. But somewhere in the gentle quiet of your office, beyond the sound of distant bells and the faint snore of Nikitas's pigeon, you feel the rhythm of an empire still pulsing through ink and candlelight. The next scroll you unfurl is unusually sticky, as if someone spilled honey on it, a common occupational hazard, considering how much of the Byzantine tax economy was paid in it. Your fingers reluctantly peel it open, revealing a cramped block of text, detailing one of the empire's most infamous levies, the Chrysargeron. You blink a few times. The ink is old, but the disdain is fresh. Even here, centuries later, the scribe's tone reads like someone deeply over this particular tax, the Chrysargeron. If you can believe it was a tax levied every 4 years, on all who earned income from non-agricultural work. Sounds standard, right? Now here's the twist. It didn't matter what you did. Tailor street performer, coin clipper, or perfumed juggler of mildly trained parrots. Pay up. Even prostitutes, dancers, and soothsayers, many of whom had no stable income, were included. You could almost hear the exasperated sighs echoing across the centuries. You lean closer to read an entry listing taxable professions in the Antioch district. It's a strange roll call of human ambition: wool dyers, charm sellers, camel renters, and one man simply called He, who balances pots. No one is quite sure what he did, but he owed 6 numismata all the same. It gets better. This tax wasn't just disliked, it was feared. It drained the poorest, crushed the struggling, and punished anyone who dared to earn a living without a field and a plow. Imagine working 4 straight years, selling embroidered sandals, only to have the government show up with a bill for half your profit and a suspiciously leaky bag for collection. Historians still argue whether the Chrysargeron was meant to encourage farming over commerce, or if it simply evolved from earlier Roman customs, with no one brave enough to cancel it. Either way, it was unpopular. So unpopular that Emperor Anastasius, bless his bureaucratic soul, abolished it in 498 AD. That's right. He walked into history books, not with war nor conquest, but by ending a tax so hated that it made tax collectors blush, and the reaction utterly unhinged joy. Some communities celebrated with religious processions. Others rang church bells for days. You half expect someone tried to name their child Anastasius, just out of gratitude. Imagine that. This is my son. Tax-free Gregorios. You gently fold the scroll and reach for another. This one's thicker, bound in leather, and reeks of moldering ink and clove oil. The label, Special Commodities Assessments. You brace yourself. Within minutes, you're knee-deep in an alphabet soup of bizarre taxable items. Crocodile skin taxed. Street music performed with a goat drum taxed. Dyes made from fermented sea snails, absolutely taxed and reportedly vile, smelling enough to empty a tavern. There's even an entry on urban animal trainers. Apparently, the empire had people licensed specifically to wrangle monkeys used for puppet shows. Their income was modest, their social status lower, but by heavens, the IRS equivalent still found them. And it's not just people who got taxed. Places were taxed too. Bridges, ports, bathhouses, even the ferry boats that crossed the Golden Horn. You find a charming note about a ferry operator who tried to dodge payment by rowing passengers a few meters short of the official tax boundary and making them swim the rest of the way. Innovative, but ultimately fined. You stop for a moment and scratch your head. The Byzantine Empire ran a tax machine so vast, so creatively thorough, it managed to make modern red tape look positively elegant. Every aspect of daily life was catalogued, assessed, and scribbled down by candlelight. But taxation wasn't just about state revenue. It was power. The ability to tax meant the ability to shape society, reward allies, and punish dissenters. If an emperor didn't like a certain guild, say the silk smugglers from Bithynia, he could hit them with new assessments, a merchant group growing too wealthy, recalculate their obligations, and presto, instant humility. You leaf through a curious parchment, listing fines paid in lieu of moral repentance. Basically, a secular confessional with a fiscal twist. Some people paid not for what they did, but for what they might have done if caught. You find an entry reading Clementos of Smyrna, paid 3 nomismata for impure thoughts during festival. Declined to specify object of temptation. The official note just says, better not to know, and still, it all ties back to that ancient tension, the empire's need to fill its coffers versus its people's creative resistance. You chuckle at a tax collector's note from Cyprus. No sign of taxable trade. Entire village apparently engaged in collective nap, but the system worked mostly. Through floods, fires, palace coups, and at least one accidental goat uprising the empire, kept filing those tax reports. And as long as the parchment kept rolling in the gears of Constantinople turned, at the back of the ledger you find a faded marginalia, doodled by a bored scribe, an image of an ox chasing a tax collector with a pitchfork. The caption, Justice Sixth Indiction. You smile. Even 1,000 years ago, tax jokes slapped. You set the scroll aside and yawn. Somewhere outside, a bell chimes 2 slow notes, echoing down the stone streets. You imagine a monk crossing a cloister, a cat skulking beneath a fig tree, and perhaps a clerk just like you, squinting at a list of taxable acrobats. The Byzantine Empire was many things holy, brutal, artistic, paranoid, but above all, it was methodical. It had a rule, a form or a levy for nearly everything. And for every person who prayed to escape their taxes, there was another soul, hired to write them down. One more candle gutters as you move to the next scroll. No rest yet. There are still tariffs on nutmeg licenses for bread sellers, and a suspicious number of unpaid wig taxes to document. You're squinting again. The candles burned low, and the wax has started to pool in a way that suggests it may eat through the table by morning. You grab another scroll already curling at the edges and unroll it to find the imperial seal, worn but still faintly golden. This one comes straight from the Patriarchate, stamped with both the Emperor's emblem and a haloed cross. You already know what that means: divine justification. The Empire's favorite excuse for doing nearly anything, including and especially levying taxes. And here it is in full papyrus glory. A sermon turned decree affirming that taxation was not just civic duty, but sacred obligation. According to this beautifully overwrought scroll, to pay your taxes was to support God's appointed ruler, and by extension, participate in the divine maintenance of the universe. No pressure. You sigh. Somewhere in this world there's a baker being shaken down by a guy quoting St. Paul. The Byzantine Empire was not content with ordinary administration. No, it needed theological justification for its bureaucracy. The emperor wasn't merely a ruler, he was God's representative on earth. So when his agents showed up at your door, asking for grain coins or that suspiciously new-looking chicken coop, they weren't just tax collectors. They were holy envoys. With quills, you read a line aloud under your breath. To resist the fiscal will of the basileus is to resist divine order and sow discord in the cosmos. That's a lot for missing a copper coin payment. Historians still argue whether this fusion of religion and taxation was a cynical manipulation or a genuinely believed doctrine. Either way, it worked. Sermons reinforced imperial decrees. Monks helped interpret tax codes, and bishops blessed grain inventories. It was all very holy and very financially convenient. You flip the scroll and find a list of monasteries and churches that were at one time subject to taxation. You lean in. Wait, monasteries. Weren't they exempt? Well, yes. And no. Like everything in Byzantium, it depended. Monasteries were technically outside the scope of standard taxation. They were spiritual havens, not economic engines. But in practice, many were wealthy landholders with multiple revenue streams, wool production, olive presses, and renting out property. So naturally, imperial officials took notice. What followed was centuries of awkward negotiations, passive-aggressive edicts, and very polite letters beginning with, "To our most holy and economically prosperous brethren." Some emperors taxed monasteries, heavily arguing they profited like any other estate. Others offered exemptions, hoping to curry favor with the church. Still others issued contradictory policies within a single reign. One poor monastery reportedly received 3 different tax assessments and 2 exemptions in the same year. You picture an elderly abbot chasing off scribes with a candlestick, muttering prayers and insults in equal measure, and still the religious overtones remained. The scroll you're holding ends with a quote from a well-known archbishop: "The Lord loves a cheerful giver, especially one who files receipts." You don't know whether to laugh or convert. As the candle hiccups, you move to a new parchment, a set of instructions from the imperial treasury, to local priests. The title, "On the Counting of Souls and Chickens." You're not kidding. Apparently, village priests were frequently enlisted to help estimate populations and taxable goods. Why? Because they knew their flocks, both spiritual and feathered. Births, deaths, marriages, new barns, and suspicious surges in goat ownership, all conveniently noted in the parish registry. You run your fingers over a footnote. Should a priest conceal taxable assets, he shall answer both to man and to heaven. Again with the divine consequences. Still, these spiritual civic collaborations weren't always harmonious. Priests sometimes inflated numbers to appear prosperous. Other times, they downplayed wealth to protect their communities. There's one note here accusing a bishop of baptizing pigs to claim they were part of his congregation, and therefore untaxable. It's not clear whether the pigs were saved, but they were definitely taxed. Despite the tension, the church and the state danced an intricate duet. Taxes funded military defenses, infrastructure, and ironically church repairs. In return, religious authorities offered legitimacy to imperial policies. The balance was delicate, sometimes fiery, and always enshrined in scrolls like this one. You stretch your legs listening to the slow drip of water from the cistern outside. Maybe it's raining, or maybe that's just another clerk crying into their ink pot. You wouldn't blame them. The merging of religion and taxation permeated everything. Econs graced treasury offices. Tax day prayers were not uncommon, and some communities believed that overpaying taxes might reduce time in purgatory. You note one letter from a desperate merchant, donating half his earnings for the soul of his mother, and the forgiveness of 3 years' tax evasion. And yet, there were limits. Emperors who leaned too heavily on religious rhetoric without delivering results, say a functioning aqueduct or a non-rotten grain shipment, often found their sermons falling on skeptical ears. One official lamented that the people demand both salvation and sanitation. Still, you can't deny it worked. For centuries, this sacred scaffolding helped hold the Byzantine fiscal system together. It lent moral gravity to dull obligations. It turned tax collection into a liturgy of statehood, and it ensured that at the end of the day, the empire's real trinity was faith, bureaucracy, and finance. You blink slowly, the scent of wax and damp parchment filling your nose. Somewhere deep in the palace, a choir rehearses, probably for a feast, or a coronation, or maybe just another tax proclamation, dressed in gold leaf and holy water. You put the scroll down your fingers, smudged with ancient ink and tired holiness. Maybe tomorrow, you'll light a candle, not for prayer, but for tax relief, divine or otherwise. Your spine protests audibly as you bend to reach a new bundle, this one tied with rough string and suspiciously stained with something dark and unidentifiable. You untie it gingerly, revealing a leather folder labeled Field Reports of Tax Farmers' Year of the 7th Indiction. Ah, yes. Time to step into the muddy boots of the empire's most misunderstood villain, the Byzantine tax farmer. Contrary to what the name might suggest, tax farmers didn't actually farm anything. Not unless you count resentment. These men, usually low-level nobles or enterprising locals, were contracted by the state to collect taxes in far-off districts. They paid the empire in advance, then turned around and squeezed that same amount, plus a little bonus from the population. In essence, they were freelancers in a job nobody liked. You unroll a field diary, ink-splotched and rain-wrinkled. The handwriting is erratic, slanted from being written on horseback, or possibly during a panic. It begins, "Arrived in Kelbasa." Villagers feigned ignorance of calendar, claimed it was still last year. One man offered soup instead of taxes. Tax farming was always a gamble. You paid up front, then took your chances with peasant cooperation weather and the occasional wolf attack. It could make you rich or deeply unpopular, mostly the latter. Many of these men traveled with guards, not for formality, for survival. In one hilarious but also very tragic report, the tax farmer from Trebizond notes that a local elder told him the village had spiritually paid already by offering prayers. The farmer's response, "Regrettably, Treasury does not accept prayer beads." That entry ends with a terse note, "Donkey stolen." Camp moved uphill. Historians still argue whether tax farming was an efficient solution to the empire's sprawling geography, or a guaranteed way to foster corruption and rural unrest. The answer is probably both. The state got its money up front. The farmers got creative, and the peasants got suspicious. You flip to another entry describing the process of assessing property. Contrary to popular belief, tax farmers didn't just roll into a village with a bag of coins and a mean stare. There was protocol. You had to walk the fields, measure the land usually with knotted cords or rough yardsticks, and inspect stored goods. Granaries were opened herds, counted sometimes even marriages recorded, to estimate household productivity. It was part census, part shakedown, and part community theater. One scribe describes a moment where a farmer demanded to see a family's taxable cow. The family presented a cow clearly elderly, arthritic, and possibly blind. The scribe notes cow mooed once, then laid down. Assessed at half value, harsh but efficient. In some provinces, locals were known to hide goods in nearby caves or bribe neighboring villagers to claim fewer animals. Other times, entire communities vanished for a few days, conveniently reappearing just after the tax collectors left. One entry simply reads, "Village empty. No fires, no noise. Suspicious smell of recent stew." There were workarounds, of course. Strategic generosity was a known tactic. Villagers might offer the tax farmer a fine meal, a place to rest, maybe even a handmade cloak. You read one report where the farmer admits to lowering assessments due to the exceptional flavor of the lamb stew. The empire ran on coin, yes, but also on hospitality bribes and guilt-fueled favors. Yet despite their methods, tax farmers weren't completely unchecked. Some fell under scrutiny from the central government, especially if complaints piled up. There are recorded trials, public and humiliating, where farmers had to justify their collections before judges. Sometimes they were fined, occasionally exiled. Once, according to a side note, one particularly greedy fellow was reassigned to tax fishermen in a region with no water. Still, most got away with the worst they could do while maintaining plausible deniability. You read a final entry scrawled in a shaking hand, "Final collection. Weather foul. Villagers chased us with brooms. Bread moldy. Considering career change." But not all stories were hostile. Some farmers, especially those from the same regions they worked, built relationships with locals. They extended deadlines, overlooked minor infractions, and sometimes paid shortfalls themselves, hoping to avoid drawing imperial ire. One report ends tenderly, left collection incomplete. Widow with 4 sons, gave her own share from my purse. May God forgive the discrepancy. It wasn't always greed. Sometimes it was survival. Sometimes it was mercy. You glance around your dim office, the air thick with parchment dust. The empire felt vast, overwhelming 1,000 moving parts, connected by people like this sweaty, nervous tax farmers, trudging across muddy hills, dodging bribes and bad weather, trying not to get stabbed with a wooden spoon. In the corner of the folder, you find a tiny sketch, a stick figure with what might be a scroll in one hand and a sheep in the other. The sheep has angry eyebrows. Underneath, someone's written, "The True Tax Authority." You lean back, closing your eyes just for a second. You imagine it now, a weary man approaching a smoke-dusted village at dusk, scroll in one hand, boots squelching with every step. Children peer out from behind doors. Dogs bark once, then fall silent. The villagers gather cautious but resigned. It's tax season again, and somewhere far away, a clerk in Constantinople, someone like you, is waiting for that scroll, that awkward, sweaty record of how the empire's coins were gathered 4 goats at a time. You stretch your legs under the splintering desk, cracking your knees in rhythm with the creaking ceiling beams. Outside, Constantinople exhales another soft gust of wind off the Bosphorus, and inside the night continues its slow drip of hours. You pull the next scroll toward you. Its seal is broken, its edges curled like old bread crust, and its title scrawled with unmistakable irritation, decrees regarding the capitatio for senators and the urban class. Ah, yes, the rich. Turns out they weren't spared either, and you're about to dive into a surprisingly petty chapter of imperial taxation. Buckle in, because the capitatio, a head tax originally designed for the common man, decided to climb the social ladder. By the 6th century, the Byzantine Senate was more ceremonial than functional. Most senators spent their days attending public ceremonies, financing churches, or occasionally lending money at rates that made bankers blush. But when the empire needed funds, say after a little thing like a Civil War earthquake, or overly optimistic gold leaf renovation, the capitatio didn't discriminate. You read a decree issued under Emperor Justin II. It states somewhat apologetically that those blessed with wealth must not forget their imperial obligation to share in fiscal burdens. In simpler terms, even you, Senator Baldi, must pay up. It wasn't just the amount, it was the insult. The capitatio was originally meant for peasants' laborers, and the dusty folks who looked permanently confused by bureaucracy. Applying it to senators and merchants was like asking your neighborhood duke to sweep the marketplace. It didn't go over well. You find a letter of protest, elegantly penned in dramatic curls of ink. The writer, a certain Senator Theodolos, argues that he has donated 3 chapels, 2 fountains, and 1 mosaic of St. Polycarp, and therefore should be spared from this vulgar tax. His scroll concludes with, "I am not a peasant. My neck is unused to such burdens." You can almost hear the imperial clerk snorting into his inkpot. Historians still argue whether this expansion of the capitatio was a necessary measure or a petty imperial flex. Either way, it symbolized something critical. No one was too big to be taxed in Byzantium. The emperor was God's regent, sure, but he was also the head accountant. And everyone from fishmongers to senators had to file their paperwork. You trace your fingers over another document stamped in red wax and marked with a double-headed eagle. This one details exceptions, and there were many. The imperial court loved its loopholes. Friends of the palace, certain guilds and donors of large public works could secure exemptions, reduced rates, or flat-out forgiveness. Naturally, this created its own economy. One scroll lists a man who paid for the paving of a street, and in return received 15 years of tax immunity. That same street was repaved 3 times in 20 years by 3 different men, each earning their own exemption. The road, still mostly mud. Then there were the anonymous gifts, unmarked coin pouches, donations to the church, conveniently redirected to government offices, and rare imports handed to officials for cultural enrichment. You can practically smell the silk and suspicion, but sometimes the system hit back. One infamous episode stands out in the scrolls you're reading. A particularly wealthy merchant family, let's call them the Argyrioi, tried to smuggle a large shipment of incense into Constantinople. Not to avoid customs duty, mind you, but to avoid triggering a luxury tax. When caught, they claimed it was a holy offering. The tax inspector's note is priceless. Even holy smoke must pay its dues. You shuffle deeper into the stack and find a curious side note about beard taxes. Yes, beard taxes. For a short period, no one agrees exactly when the empire flirted with a policy taxing adult males who shaved their beards. Why, theories range from preserving traditional Roman masculinity to punishing vanity. One account hints that it may have started as a joke and then became real. You imagine a particularly clean-shaven senator awkwardly holding up a mirror in protest. The urban class had its own set of tax headaches. Merchants, artisans, and skilled tradespeople often faced overlapping levies, stall fees, guild dues, import tariffs, and a sales tax suspiciously called the obol of dignity. It's unclear who invented that name, but you're guessing it was someone with a good sense of irony. One document from Thessaloniki outlines the tax schedule for a cobbler's stall: rent, leather duty, daylight usage fee, yes, really, and a music license if they dared to whistle while they worked. The cobbler's note: I paid more to exist than to sell shoes. And then there's the matter of late fees. You unfold a slip listing penalties for delayed payment. They started small, extra solidus here, a lost goat there, but could escalate quickly. One baker you read was fined a full month's earnings for missing the annual inventory count. He wrote, I was busy baking for His Holiness's banquet. Perhaps the Lord shall pay what I owe. Spoiler, the Lord did not. Still some found ways to fight back. Civic unrest wasn't uncommon. You find a scroll detailing a tax riot in Nicaea, where local traders locked the gates and refused to let imperial inspectors enter the city. The emperor sent a polite reply, accompanied by 2 warships. One final entry catches your eye, a kind of exhausted memo from a scribe. We tax the rich like the poor, and the poor like the rich. The only difference is who yells louder. You silently salute that scribe. He gets it. As your candle flickers and the parchment scratches beneath your fingers, you realize something sobering. The Byzantine tax system wasn't cruel because it hated the rich. It was cruel because it didn't trust anyone. And in a world where fortunes rose and fell as fast as emperors, that might have been the only rational approach. You set the scroll down and listen to the echoing clink of a distant guard's boots. Somewhere out there, a senator is grumbling over a wine levy, and someone not unlike you is scribbling furiously under candlelight, muttering I told them to tax the beard, not the face. Your eyes burn as you unroll the next scroll. The ink faded, the parchment curled like a sleepy cat. This one is heavier, older, and smells faintly of mildew sweat, and somehow beans. Its title sends a chill down your spine. Inventory and Provisions Annona Militaris. You feel the weight of those words in your bones. The Annona Militaris wasn't a tax so much as an ordeal. Instituted during the late Roman Empire, and kept alive by Byzantium's bureaucratic willpower, it was the imperial system's way of feeding, housing, and occasionally outfitting its military, using everything except money. Because why make things simple when you could instead create an economic migraine? You trace a line of text with your finger. The first entry lists 4,000 bushels of wheat, 900 amphorae of wine, and 83 pairs of sandals, all delivered to a garrison on the eastern frontier, and not a single gold coin in sight. That's the point. The Annona Militaris was paid in kind, a logistical tax extracted in real, tangible goods. And this tax didn't just fall on farmers or merchants. No, this baby had reach. Grain sure. Horses absolutely. Tents firewood, salted pork wax for candles, and even leather straps for the soldiers' greaves. Everything was fair game. Imagine owning a cart and being taxed not on its value, but by being required to lend it with oxen to the state for a month. You'd be reimbursed eventually. Probably. Maybe. Well, not really. The scroll shifts tone midway through, as if the scribe got angrier with every line. You read supplies demanded exceed reserves, villagers forced to send winter grain early, livestock weakening, roads frozen, no compensation. It's less a tax ledger and more a cry for help. Historians still argue whether the Annona Militaris was sustainable, brilliant, or quietly disastrous. In theory, it allowed the empire to sustain its enormous army without bankrupting itself. In practice, it drained rural economies and left people juggling hunger and loyalty like flaming torches. Great if you're the general. Less so if you're a cabbage farmer outside Dyrrhachium. A dry list of provisions follows. It's haunting. You skim through. 22 cloaks for winter campaigns, 14 replacement spear shafts, 6 sacks of dried lentils rejected due to unpleasant odor, 1 shipment of turnips accidentally sent to the wrong garrison, then requisitioned anyway. You chuckle softly at the note about the turnips. Somewhere a soldier sat chewing cold root vegetables, meant for someone else's dinner table. Empire logistics at work. The scroll contains diagrams, 2 rough maps of supply routes with thick ink trails, showing paths across Thrace, Bithynia, and the Anatolian interior. Some are marked with red X's, and the word ambush. You sigh. Not even taxes are safe from bandits. 1 page folds out into a list of what each district was expected to provide. It reads like a twisted grocery list. You note that the western provinces owed more preserved fish, while Cappadocia was the empire's designated mule zone. It's not glamorous, but someone had to be in charge of mule duty, and then you find an audit report. It begins stiffly. Upon inspection, the provided boots were not of satisfactory quality. Many lacked soles. Some, it appeared, were simply 2 left feet sewn together. The inspector's summary concludes, discipline must be enforced. Otherwise, the soldiers shall march with blisters and resentment. This one scroll has more drama than a monastery bake sale. You flip to a marginal note that reads, village elders attempted to disguise onions as dried apples to fulfill fruit quota. Result, disappointment. You pause, imagining the scene. A line of tax inspectors sniffing suspiciously at pungent, knobbly apples. But the Annona Militaris had a darker side, too. Failure to meet quotas didn't just result in fines. It could mean confiscation. Requisition officers, armed and often accompanied by soldiers, had the authority to seize goods on the spot. You find several chilling entries. Took final grain store from widow. Left 2 hens. Barn burned after refusal to yield oxen. Elders wept openly. Children watched. You lean back, letting the waxy parchment rest against your lap. The lines between tax and coercion blurred often in this system. What began as fiscal policy could quickly morph into state-sanctioned extortion. And yet, this was considered normal, expected. It kept the troops fed, the empire moving, and the illusion of stability alive. One letter tucked into the scroll's folds is from a soldier. His handwriting is rushed but heartfelt. Tell mother the boots arrived late, worn already, but better than nothing. Bread was stale, but wine passable. I share a tent with 4 others. We joke that the mule eats better than we do. There's a postscript, too. Taxes make us miserable, but at least we're warm, and therein lies the knot of it all. These harsh levies, these overburdened towns and trembling carts full of turnips, they fed the heart of Byzantium's military machine. An empire always at war, always on edge, needed a tax like Annona Militaris to keep marching. Whether it was wise or brutal remains an open question, but it worked more or less. As you roll the scroll closed, your fingers pause over one last line, scribbled in the margins by an anonymous clerk. If the army wins, no one remembers the cost. If it loses, everyone remembers the onions. You let out a quiet laugh. Fair enough. Outside, the night deepens. The wind shifts. Somewhere, an imperial garrison is chewing moldy cheese. And here you are, still tracking the movement of bread loaves and boots, through an empire that filed its taxes in crates of onions and bags of hay. You flex your fingers and carefully unfurl the next scroll. The parchment crackles like old firewood. Across the top, penned in a lazy looping hand, are the words, "On the reporting of agricultural yields in the provinces." You already know what this means: passive aggression, wilted wheat, and a lot of very creative understatements, because tonight you're crawling into the sweaty heart of the Byzantine land tax system. It's equal parts agricultural arithmetic, theatrical denial, and peasant-level performance art. The scroll begins with a set of yield declarations from a village near Sardis. According to their report, they harvested approximately 4.5 bushels of barley, 2 sad olives, and a suspiciously thin chicken. You blink. That's not a tax record. It's a cry for help. But here's the thing. The village probably did not produce only 4 bushels and a mystery hen. They likely harvested 10 times that. Maybe 20. And they weren't about to tell the empire. Why? Because land taxes weren't just based on how much land you owned. They were based on what that land produced. And so began a game of agricultural theater. Each year, imperial tax agents, sometimes honest, often grumpy, descended on farms to inspect crops. Fields were measured. Granaries were poked. Sheep were counted. And every villager suddenly developed a case of collective amnesia. Barley. I hardly know her. No, sir, those are not olive trees. They're just decorative. The wheat looked good last week. Then we blinked and it all fell over. You read a note from an inspector clearly at the end of his rope. The entire village claims to be fasting indefinitely. Refused to answer questions about apple orchard, which they insist is haunted. And really, who can blame them? The land tax Georgicon Telos was merciless. It assumed not only that your fields produced, but that they produced exactly as expected every year rain, or shine locust or fire. If you had land, the empire expected you to squeeze olives from stone if necessary. Historians still argue whether this rigidity encouraged innovation or simply promoted dishonesty. Some say it pushed farmers to improve output. Others argue it just incentivized everyone to become really, really good liars. You flip the scroll and discover a delightful bit of bureaucratic revenge. In one district, the tax office began sending 3 inspectors instead of 1. 1 to ask questions, 1 to watch the first, and 1 to pretend to be a traveling monk to catch villagers off guard. That's either genius or deeply unwell. In retaliation, some communities staged coordinated underproduction plays. They deliberately leave certain fields fallow and use others for low-yield crops publicly. The good harvest, hidden in caves, or sold before the taxman even arrived. You find an entry labeled Inspection Incident Ephesus Region. It's a dramatic, nearly poetic account of a tax collector walking through a suspiciously pristine village. Everything too quiet, too neat. Every barn locked, every animal conspicuously absent. His only note: I have never seen a place so clean, so barren, and so smug. But it wasn't just the peasants who played games. Large landowners, often nobles, churchmen, or absentee elites, had entire teams of accountants devoted to bending the truth. They'd shuffle ownership between relatives, create fake tenancy records, and hire professional scribes to clarify their yields. One monastery claimed their wheat fields were solely for decorative contemplation. Their tax bill was miraculously reduced. You read a letter from a local governor to the Imperial Tax Bureau: I am besieged by saints and loopholes. They offer prayers instead of receipts. You can practically hear his teeth grinding through the parchment. In the margins, someone's doodled a cow wearing a bishop's hat. The tax system tried to adapt. Satellite offices were established closer to rural centers. Local informants, often rival farmers, were quietly encouraged to tattle. In one village, a teenager reported his father for hiding barley. His reward: a goat. The father's punishment: 2 goats taken away. Balance achieved. Still, compliance was patchy at best. You read a line that sums it all up: our people are honest in all things, except wheat. Even the method of reporting yields evolved. Villagers were expected to fill out tax forms known as practica, long dry documents, outlining everything they grew, owned, or merely touched that season. Failure to complete it meant imperial agents would do it for you, and they were not known for optimism. One practicon from the Pontus region shows a man who, due to clerical error, was assigned 36 goats. He owned 2. When he complained, the tax office replied, "Perhaps you are simply unaware of the goats. Look harder." The problem, of course, was that the empire needed the food. Desperately. Urban centers, military units, and naval fleets all depended on these rural tax assessments. And so the system stumbled forward, built on numbers everyone knew were false, processed by clerks too tired to argue, and enforced by men hoping not to be hit with a broom. You roll the scroll back up and stare at the pile still waiting. Somewhere in there, you suspect is a record of a village that claimed its entire barley crop had been stolen by spirits. And someone in the tax office probably marked it plausible. Outside, the stars over Constantinople seemed to twinkle with bureaucratic exasperation. You imagine a peasant waking up before dawn, scratching his head, and wondering if he should report his pear tree. It only produced 2 pears. One was eaten by a crow. The other might be a bribe. The Byzantine Empire, in all its glittering glory, was held up not just by armies and emperors, but by the tired, clever, and often entirely fictional numbers scribbled onto scrolls like this. Numbers born of drought deception and the occasional haunted orchard. You yawn, and for a brief absurd moment wonder if there's a tax on scribes who copy lies with great sincerity. The scroll before you smells oddly of goat, which, given the topic, is appropriate. You untie its brittle cord, and across the top in smeared ink it reads, "Alternative payments and livestock-based levies." Ah, yes, when citizens paid taxes not in coins, but in chicken's cheese and personal confusion. Welcome to the rural hustle of Byzantine tax life, where if you didn't have money, you got creative. The Byzantine economy wasn't exactly swimming in coinage, especially outside the big cities. Solid gold numismata were rare in the hands of peasants. Most villages ran on barter seasonal markets and mutual debts involving turnips. So when the taxman came knocking and you had no coin, you offered what you had: good services, or the most statistically disappointing goat in all of Asia Minor. You read a scroll from a small Thracian hamlet. It lists taxes paid as follows: 2 sacks of barley, 5 ceramic bowls, 1 chipped, 3 jars of honey, 1 spinning wheel, 1 exceptionally grumpy goose. The imperial scribe notes goose unusable for military rations. Attempted to peck inspector, released with prejudice. This wasn't just improvisation, it was official policy. The empire allowed payments in kind when currency wasn't available. But of course, value had to be assessed. This meant that some poor bureaucrat, usually with a bad knee and a strong sense of irony, had to determine whether your smoked fish was worth 3 copper follies or only 2, and that led to the Byzantine art of negotiated tax payment. You find examples of villagers haggling their way through tax season, like souk merchants. This cheese is aged smell. That bouquet 3 months minimum. That is mold, not bouquet. 2 coins. Historians still argue whether this flexibility made the system more humane or simply more chaotic. Sure, it allowed struggling families to stay afloat, but it also flooded storage depots with mismatched socks, poorly baked bread, and one notorious shipment of olive oil that turned out to be pond water. A marginal note reads, "Inspector's hands still smell. Village denies wrongdoing." You flip to a report on livestock assessments. Horses were precious, valued highly, and taxed accordingly. Donkeys slightly less so. Chickens were everywhere, and thus treated with disdain. One family in Cappadocia tried to pay their full tax with 27 chickens. They were accepted, but only after the collector tested their egg-laying productivity. A quote from the inspection: egg yield poor. 1 chicken appears to be a feathered liar. Some households paid in textiles, wool, linen, dyed cloth. Others in tools, baskets, or barrels of wine, often tested on the spot. In coastal regions, dried fish and sea salt became currency. Inland, it might be spiced meat flour or jars of preserved plums. You find a delightful scroll documenting a tax delivery via ox cart. The load 1 small barrel of pickled onions and an exquisitely carved wooden ladle. The tax agent, either moved or confused, accepted it in full. The ladle now sits apparently in a treasury cabinet labeled miscellaneous goodwill, but not every payment went smoothly. Rejection was common. Goods deemed too old, too few, or too suspicious were returned, or worse, confiscated without credit. You read about a farmer who offered 7 sheep. 6 were acceptable. The 7th was moody, limped aggressively, and tried to eat the collector's robe. It was rejected with a note beast not fit for shepherd nor sausage. Then there were services. Blacksmiths could sometimes pay their taxes by offering hours of labor. Carpenters likewise. Even midwives in some regions received partial exemptions if they agreed to assist the garrison's families. There's a charming story from a village near Antioch where the local baker baked 400 small loaves for soldiers in lieu of coins. The response: bread, slightly dry but edible. Tax credit applied. The problem, of course, was storage. The empire wasn't designed to house 800 jars of honey and a dozen angry goats, so it turned to a new solution: redistribution. Tax collectors offloaded surplus goods to nearby garrisons' monasteries, or even merchant caravans. One scroll details a series of trade triangles in which 3 provinces swapped chickens, grain, and wine, like a Byzantine version of rock, paper, scissors. Still, the system had its casualties. Some families in desperation handed over heirlooms bracelets. Religious icons even carved wooden toys. In theory, such items were to be returned once debts were paid. In practice, well, let's just say the imperial warehouse wasn't big on tracking sentimental value. One haunting note reads, "Family wept. Toy horse left in exchange. Promised return. Filed under pending." You pause. The scrolls paint a picture of a deeply human system. Clunky, inconsistent, often unfair, but human. Villagers bartering for time. Parents begging for extensions. Tax agents trying to balance imperial quotas with local realities. There's even one account of a collector who, moved by a widow's plight, paid her dues from his own salary. His superiors reprimanded him. The local children painted his likeness on the side of a barn, with wings. Somewhere in the margins, someone scrawled a doodle of a cow wearing spectacles. Underneath, chief valuator of cheese. You laugh softly. It's absurd. It's also real. You close the scroll and look at your ink-stained hands. They've handled more goats on paper tonight than most people manage in a lifetime. And somewhere, you're certain a tired man with a rope belt is walking toward a dusty office, leading 2 donkeys and carrying 3 pots of questionable yogurt, hoping this year's tax burden can be paid in something other than disappointment. The next scroll is ominously thin, bound in faded red thread, and marked simply, "Privileged records. Do not copy." Naturally, you ignore that and open it. That's your job tonight: snoop, transcribe, and try not to nod off into your inkwell. You begin to read. At first, it's just standard high-level chatter quotas, summaries, and notes passed between ministries. But halfway down the page, you spot something odd. A brief report hastily written with a double underline concerning Theodolos, the logothete accounting irregularities, and the missing coin chests of Nicaea. Ah, here it is. The story of the accountant who knew too much. Theodolos Logothete of the Genicon. The empire's main finance office was no ordinary scribe. He wasn't bent over a desk copying goat tallies like you. He oversaw the treasury's operations, revenue projections, provincial allocations, and apparently secrets worth hiding. According to this scroll, Theodulos flagged discrepancies in troop provisions. His ledger showed 10,000 numismata, allocated to the garrisons along the eastern frontier. Yet field reports noted only 6,000 arrived. He double-checked, cross-referenced, even sent letters to multiple provinces. His reward, a vague transfer request, and a new job in revenue simplification. Which you note sounds suspiciously like a career coffin. Historians still argue whether Theodolos was a whistleblower, or just very bad at keeping quiet in a system built on selective silence. But the scroll doesn't mince words. Weeks after his reassignment, he vanished. No record of departure, no public statement. Just a scribbled entry in a back-office note. Logothete Theodolos no longer assigned. Desk reassigned to junior scribe with excellent penmanship. That's unsettling. You find a follow-up memorandum. It refers to an audit readjustment initiative spearheaded by new leadership. Several financial ledgers were revised. Missing coinage was blamed on bandits, or possibly rats. One memo actually says, likely both. Rats with criminal intent. Right. The thing is, this wasn't unusual. The Byzantine bureaucracy, efficient as it often was, operated in a fog of quiet intimidation and glittering opacity. People who rocked the boat too hard often found themselves in positions of reflection. That's a nice phrase for exile monastery placement or convenient disappearance. You flip the scroll and find more names. Several provincial tax officials removed for incompetence, but the annotations suggest they'd simply questioned inconsistencies. One tax officer in Cilicia reportedly filed a complaint about double quotas. His letter ends with request clarification. Cannot squeeze wheat from dust. No response. But there is a follow-up note officer reassigned to road maintenance. Desert region. Still, for all the suspicion, these scrolls reveal something else, just how intricate the financial system truly was. Every district had a budget. Every shipment of coins was documented in theory, and every expenditure logged, reviewed, and reviewed again by men like Theodolos. And when the sums didn't add up, well, best not to ask. You come across a chart delicately inked, showing coin dispersals from Constantinople to the eastern military outposts. The distribution lines are clean idealistic, but in the margins, someone has scrawled in red. This assumes no delays, no theft, no bribery, and no bad math. A fantasy. It's easy to forget that behind the empire's golden mosaics and theological debates stood men with abacuses, gritted teeth, and ulcer-inducing spreadsheets. One scroll details a particularly brutal audit. The Genicon sent a team to audit the provincial treasury in Bithynia. After 3 weeks, they reported 472 accounting errors, 9 suspicious overpayments, and 1 missing audit inspector. A note at the bottom. He returned on foot, but will no longer speak of the onions. You're not sure what that means, but you suspect he's earned the silence. Byzantine accounting wasn't just about coin. It was about power. Whoever controlled the numbers controlled the narrative about military strength, economic health, even the emperor's image. A budget surplus could prop up a weak reign. A deficit could justify raising taxes or blaming the previous regime. So it's no surprise that occasionally the math got creative. You find a personal letter tucked inside the scrolls. It's unsigned but clearly written by someone high up. We round the numbers for the good of the people. Exactitude breeds unrest. Let the villagers think all is well. Let the soldiers think they are paid. The empire is a ledger written in hope. You shiver, not from cold, from recognition. Still, there were moments of stubborn honesty. You read about one elderly clerk in Nicaea who refused to falsify reports. Instead, he noted every missing coin, every unpaid duty, and every shipment that arrived light. His records were impeccable, beautiful even. His punishment promotion, then immediate retirement. But the final record in the scroll is what lingers. A memorandum detailing a ghost district, a village that had in fact been abandoned for decades due to a landslide. And yet each year, the imperial records still listed it. Tax estimates were generated, coin allotments made, grain shipments ordered. No one lived there. No one collected. No one asked why. You read the last line a little too slowly. The tax office exists to confirm itself. Outside, the night is still. You think of Theodolos, his perfect ledgers, his doomed corrections, his name now only a ghost in the margins. Maybe he was too honest. Or maybe he was simply tired of pretending that the empire added up. You close the scroll gently, as if not to wake it. Some truths sleep better that way. You reach for the next scroll, its edges slightly burnt, maybe from candle mishandling, or maybe from a scribe with particularly dramatic flair. The heading is oddly theatrical. Auditorial conduct and bureaucratic oversight best practices and emergency remedies. You groan softly. You can already feel the bureaucratic tension soaking through your fingertips. Audits in the Byzantine Empire weren't polite affairs. They weren't routine check-ins from friendly accountants with clipboards. They were thunderclouds in robe form descending on unsuspecting provincial offices, with scrolls suspicion and the terrifying power to ruin your whole week. Maybe your whole lineage. You picture it. You're a middle-tier clerk in a sleepy town near Pergamon. You've been quietly fudging goat counts for the last 5 years. You have a system. You feel secure. Then bam! A lean, pale man with suspiciously clean boots shows up at your office door holding a document with the imperial seal, and the words, "Extraordinary Audit," scrawled across it in alarming red ink. Your tea goes cold instantly. The scroll you're reading outlines precisely what happens next. First, the books are seized. Not read, seized. Immediately. The auditor brings their own copyist to prevent tampering. Second, all staff must provide testimony. Third, emergency record reconstruction may occur in which someone from Constantinople rewrites your ledgers with a confidence that's never backed by actual facts. There's a note from a village tax officer who writes, "We tried to explain that the parchment had been eaten by goats. Auditor stated, 'Then feed me lies instead.' We were unclear whether this was metaphor or threat. Audits could take weeks, sometimes months. Sometimes the auditors themselves became permanent fixtures, grim specters, who lurked in the corners of dusty offices, muttering about double entries and phantom surpluses. You find one account of a rural inspector who simply left his desk and began sleeping under it. Historians still argue whether these auditors were effective watchdogs or imperial showpieces, part genuine investigation, part intimidation tactic. Whatever the truth, their power was vast. They could fine officials' close offices, freeze shipments, and recommend reassignment imprisonment, or most terrifyingly promotion into the imperial court. And the job titles. Oh, the job titles. You read through a list of official auditorial ranks. They range from the reasonably clear eparchial supervisor to the wildly excessive senior subsecretary of revenue verification and moral reconciliation. Try fitting that on a wax tablet. But behind the grandiose names were real people. Well, mostly. You come across the story of one auditor, Basileus of Antioch, infamous for traveling with a personal band of flute players. It's unclear whether this was for intimidation or ambiance. Either way, one field agent noted, his arrival was always musical. His reports less so. Another scroll details an audit duel not with swords, but with scrolls. 2 auditors disagreed on a regional wheat quota so fiercely that they both filed contradictory reports. The emperor, confused, declared both to be correct and ordered the region to produce twice the grain. The result, a small rebellion and an unprecedented shortage of barley-based alcohol. Still, audits were a necessary evil. Without them, the empire's bureaucracy, already a tangle of ink and ego, would collapse. And so, year after year, the central government sent out its human erasers to test prod and, if needed, reset the ledgers. You find a manual 10 steps to audit integrity, complete with marginal scribbles from a clearly disgruntled scribe. Step 3. Confirm honesty of prior audits. Marginal note. None were honest. Step 7. Avoid influence from local officials. Marginal note. Do not accept goats, even friendly ones. Step 10. File duplicate copies in secret archive. Marginal note. But where is the secret archive? Good question. There's also a section on audit emergencies. If a ledger was lost, say eaten by rats or repurposed into kindling during a cold winter, auditors were authorized to reconstruct records based on reasonable inference. This meant asking townsfolk how much grain they looked like they could grow. You read an example. Farmer appears hardy. Wife plump. Estimate barley output at full rate. You sigh. Science. Sometimes, though, audits failed upwards. There's a tale of a scribe in Cherson who, after surviving 6 audits, was declared unfalsifiable and promoted to oversee 3 provinces. His nickname, the Uneditable, and of course, there were those who cracked under pressure. One scroll recounts a particularly panicked junior accountant who, when asked to produce receipts, simply burst into tears and offered his sandals. The audit report notes, sandals accepted. Records reconstructed from memory and guilt. You flip to the final entry, a poem. Yes, a poem. Titled, Ode to the Auditor. It reads, he walks with scroll and shadow wide, in numbers name, he will not hide. With ink-stained hand and furrowed brow, he ruins friendships even now. Touching, you set the scroll down with reverence. Auditors weren't loved. They weren't even tolerated, really. But they were necessary. The empire ran on fear, as much as it did on faith. And nothing inspired quite so much honest terror as a bureaucrat with a fresh quill and a very suspicious tone. Outside, a gust of wind rattles the shutters. You imagine somewhere a tired official looks at his books, hears distant flute music, and whispers to himself, "Not again." The scroll before you is massive, unreasonably so, bound in dark leather, and sealed with no fewer than 5 wax stamps. It crunches faintly as you unroll it. The title sprawls across the top in slightly smug ink codices and contradictions, provincial tax codes of the empire. This is it. The empire-wide chaos made bureaucratically official. Because for all their love of records, Byzantines were never quite able to enforce a single uniform tax system across their sprawling empire. Oh no, that would have made too much sense. Instead, they ended up with at least a dozen tax codes, each tailored to a region's unique circumstances, a phrase that here translates roughly to whoever yelled loudest in the last imperial review. You read a map drawn in exasperated strokes, color-coded by province Thrace, in blue Bithynia, in red Cappadocia, in what seems to be burnt parchment. Each area had its own set of forms, quotas, exemptions, terminology, and in one case, a provincial seal, shaped like a squid. The Central Tax Office must have had nightmares. The scroll continues in Asia Minor taxes were levied primarily by land output. In Syria, it was calculated via household productivity. Egypt, they taxed according to the Nile's mood that year, and in some outer territories, tribute was still collected in exotic animal parts and dyed feathers. You half expect someone paid their taxes in snake jokes. Historians still argue whether this system was intentionally flexible to adapt to regional economies or simply spiraled into bureaucratic absurdity over time. Likely both. Flexibility sounds noble until you realize it required a tax clerk to be fluent in 7 definitions of income and at least 3 styles of abacus notation. A field note from a traveling scribe in Dalmatia reads, "Here, they tax by tree. Olive tree, fig tree, plum tree, each with separate rate. Almond trees unregulated. Region is lawless." And then there were the units of measurement. Byzantium had a dizzying array of them, from the modios for grain to the centenarian for weight, and a highly suspicious unit called the Zygian, which one inspector claimed was approximately the mass of a sleepy donkey. You stare blankly at that and choose not to investigate further. You come across a correspondence between provincial administrators, one from Cilicia, one from Thessaly. They're both discussing an imperial edict on moderate grain contributions. The Cilician administrator writes, "We define moderate as 40% of surplus." Thessaly replies, "We define moderate as a kind word and a small hug." It's a tax tower of Babel. One empire, one emperor, but at least 12 fiscal dialects. The implications were maddening. An official reassigned from one province to another essentially had to be retrained in the local tax customs. Even worse, citizens moving between regions suddenly found themselves owing back taxes they didn't even understand. One entry tells the story of a spice merchant from Antioch who traveled west to sell goods and ended up with 4 fines, 3 contradictory licenses, and a handwritten apology from a bureaucrat who admitted, "We have no idea how cinnamon is classified here." Still, there was an attempt at unity. During the reign of Constantine VII, a short-lived push was made to create an imperial tax compendium, a unified code. It failed. Dramatically. You read the court memo draft complete, rejected by no fewer than 9 provinces. One governor set his copy on fire as demonstration. You smile. The more you read, the clearer it becomes the Byzantine Empire didn't enforce order through simplification, it ruled through complexity. An intentional knot. Tangled enough to make rebellion difficult, audits confusing, and local independence feel more like a tax trap than a liberation. Some provinces leaned into the chaos. You find a region in the southern Peloponnese that created its own tax holiday 1 day per year, when all residents brought their funniest items to offer as payment. It became a kind of reverse carnival. One year's list included a goat wearing imperial colors, a harp with no strings, but excellent craftsmanship, 7 jars labeled future grain, 1 fish named Theophilos. The scribe's summary festivities concluded. Fish returned. Even within Constantinople itself, the contradictions flourished. The city was divided into quarters, each with its own market rules, vendor taxes and street use levies. One merchant operating across 2 streets had to file separate reports for the same cart. A marginal note from the clerk reads, "Wheel crossed boundary." Fined for optimism. The empire tried to train officials to manage this madness. Tax colleges offered courses in regional codes, translation between measuring systems, and interpretive scroll reading. A curriculum outline includes a class titled Counting Livestock, while avoiding argument. You suspect it should have been a core requirement. Despite all this, the system didn't collapse. It buckled, sagged, hissed like an overfed cat, but somehow endured. Why? Because everyone played along. They argued, bribed, loopholed, and survived. It became a national pastime to grumble at taxes, flub the paperwork, and nod solemnly when the numbers didn't quite add up. You flip to the end of the scroll and find a short proverb clearly added by a tired clerk in a moment of existential honesty. In Byzantium, truth is negotiable, but taxes are forever. You sit back, letting that wash over you. Somewhere outside, a breeze rustles the ivy against the wall. Maybe it's just wind, or maybe it's the spirit of a long-dead scribe, trying to remember how many zygions were in a modios of lentils. You gently close the scroll, your fingers smudged with ink, your mind full of squid-shaped seals and plum-based assessments. There's still more to read. But for now, you take comfort in knowing that across centuries empires rise and fall, but the tax code, it just multiplies. Your next scroll is covered in smudges and soot, clearly the victim of someone who tried to use it as both a document and a potholder. Its title, written in surprisingly elegant calligraphy, reads, "Unexpected Losses. The Challenges of Tax Collection During Barbarian Raids." You sigh already, knowing what kind of mess this will be, because in the Byzantine Empire, no matter how neatly the tax ledgers were penned, or how strictly the quotas were set, there was always one unpredictable variable that tended to ruin everyone's fiscal afternoon: the occasional invasion. It didn't even have to be a full-scale invasion. Sometimes it was a rogue band of Huns or Slavs, or disgruntled ex-mercenaries with time to kill, and a suspicious interest in caravans. Whatever the case when they showed up, your tax delivery likely did not make it to the treasury. The scroll opens with a first-hand account from a provincial treasurer in Mosia left Durostorum, with 3 carts of grain, 400 solidi, and 6 guards. Met travelers with axes near the pine woods. Lost everything but sandals. Filing claim. You shake your head. Filing a claim like that ever worked? The imperial treasury tried to prepare for this. Couriers were trained in evasive tactics. Armored wagons were introduced. Some tax convoys even hired private escorts. But still, if your taxes got looted halfway between your village and Constantinople, you were still on the hook. Yes, you read that right. Even if your shipment was stolen by actual armed barbarians, the state still expected you to pay. The reasoning losses are regrettable, but not exemptive. You stare blankly at the parchment. That sounds suspiciously like something said by a man who has never seen a burning barn. Historians still argue whether this policy was a cynical strategy to keep revenue flowing, or a desperate measure born from declining security. Probably both. Either way, it put villagers and officials in a bizarre position. Send the taxes hope for the best, and if it all went wrong, pay again. Maybe with extra. One particularly bitter scroll records a village in the Balkans that was taxed 3 times in 1 year because their previous payments were looted each time. Eventually, they staged a small rebellion and declared themselves allergic to coin. The revolt was crushed in 2 days. The tax bill remained. You come across a damage assessment log. 3 oxen stolen, 12 barrels of wine looted, 7 parchment rolls destroyed, 1 inspector mildly injured, emotionally devastated. A marginal note adds, "He cried when they took the ink." Even garrisons weren't safe. A military outpost near the Armenian frontier reportedly lost its tax storage vault to a raid, and its commander was charged with negligence. He later insisted the vault was hidden beneath a prayer house. The committee replied that divine concealment did not absolve logistical failure. Still, some officials got creative. A provincial finance clerk named Sabas proposed a floating tax convoy, sending taxes by river barge, with a rotating route to confuse raiders. It worked once. The second time, the raiders brought boats. The effort was not repeated. You flip to a section labeled Emergency Substitutions. These were the measures taken when actual coinage was lost, but the empire still needed something to work with. Some villages offered livestock in lieu of payment. Others hastily gathered goods from nearby towns. One even attempted to borrow tax items from their neighbors, like medieval fiscal freeloaders. There's an entry from Lydia payment looted near Mountain Pass. Villagers presented 48 jars of pickled cabbage and a statue of St. Minas to compensate. Assessed at 60% face value, a statue of a saint as a tax substitute. You rub your temples. Of course, not all looting came from outsiders. Some convoys were hit by bandits from within the empire, disgruntled former soldiers, ambitious lords or bored nobles, with too many horses and not enough hobbies. Byzantine politics could be a dangerous game of chess, where the pawns sometimes mugged the king. You read about a tax convoy ambushed by rebels disguised as monks. The official report stated, "Their chants were impeccable. We suspected nothing until the incense was replaced with smoke bombs. The result, a complete loss of 3 months' revenue and the start of a very awkward audit. To cope with the uncertainty, some treasuries started keeping duplicates of high-value records and requiring double verification of cargo at each stage of travel. Still, errors happened. Scrolls were lost in storms. Wax seals melted in the sun. Once a tax wagon fell off a cliff due to what the report calls exuberant mule behavior. You laugh aloud at that one. Exuberant mules, the quiet saboteurs of the empire's economy. Despite the setbacks, taxes still got through, often miraculously. You find a letter from a tax courier who walked 117 miles on foot after his cart broke down. He delivered 2 leather bags filled with coin and 3 very confused chickens that somehow survived the journey. His reward, a commendation, and a replacement pair of sandals. Yet even when successful, these efforts bred tension. Villages started hiding their wealth out of fear, not just of taxation, but of what might happen after they paid. Sending off your best grain could mean watching it burn on a roadside if fate weather or Vikings intervened. The last entry is a note from a tax officer in Thrace. We send what we can. We pray it arrives. And if not, we send again. But the people are weary. Even the goats seem suspicious. You roll the scroll closed slowly. Somewhere, a tax agent stands ankle-deep in mud, watching smoke rise in the distance, holding a bag of cabbage, and wondering whether it will ever be enough. The scroll you reach for next is stained torn at the edges, and scrawled with a sense of haste that suggests its scribe was copying, while the walls around him were perhaps literally crumbling. Its bold title, Tax Continuity, in times of unrest, obligations during civil conflict. This is going to be a fun one. You already know the shape of what's coming. Because in the Byzantine Empire, there was one golden rule of fiscal administration, scribbled across the centuries in invisible but unbreakable ink. No matter what the taxes must be filed. Plague still taxed. Flood still taxed. Barbarian raids, taxed harder. Civil war tearing your province into lunch meat. Better believe there's still a grain quota due by Friday. This scroll opens with a grim anecdote. A village near Amorium had its town square flattened during a local uprising. The records office gone. The granary also gone. The tax collector found hiding in a barrel. The report reads, "Collections incomplete. Requesting delay. Immediate environment unsustainable." The imperial reply, "Delay granted. Interest applies. New deadline, Feast of St. Kyriakos." You stare at that a moment. Imagine getting a bill in the middle of an active war zone with a helpful note about feast day deadlines. And yet this was normal. The Byzantine administrative machine was designed with a kind of horrifying optimism. The belief that even if the empire was falling apart, the paperwork should remain standing. If the treasury burned down, it was to be rebuilt. If villages vanished, estimates were calculated as if they had not. Entire regions could be depopulated, but the fiscus, the imperial chest, would still list projected revenues from them. One notation even says village no longer exists. Revenue expected, as per last known condition. You half wonder if ghosts are considered viable taxpayers. Historians still argue whether this was brilliant resilience or delusion, bordering on satire. Probably both. It was a survival strategy, wrapped in bureaucracy. By refusing to admit collapse, the empire kept itself stitched together. By a quilt of projected income and polite fiction, you leaf further into the scroll and find a series of damage reports filed alongside. Revised tax ledgers. One describes a town burned during a rebellion. Entire districts flattened. Yet someone sat in the ashes, pen in hand, recalculating livestock values and scrawling 1/3 loss of sheep, 2/3 loss of sheep enclosures, remaining sheep angry. Another entry tells of a tax convoy lost during the rise of a local usurper who declared himself emperor in a single province. The legitimate government's response, "All taxes owed shall be doubled upon restoration of loyalty," which feels less like a strategy and more like the empire punishing disobedience with a calculator. But it wasn't just fire and looting. It was chaos of a more insidious kind. Civil conflicts produced shifting loyalties, overlapping authorities, and the constant risk of paying taxes to the wrong emperor. Imagine paying a full grain quota to the rebel governor in your town, only to have imperial inspectors show up 2 months later, demanding it again, plus fines for insubordination. You read a heartbreaking testimony from a town elder. "We paid the man with the banner. Then we paid the man with the spear. Now the man with the quill says we owe thrice. And that's not even counting when 2 sides of a civil war both sent tax collectors." One clerk in Isauria writes, 2 men arrived, each claiming imperial authority. We paid them both. They then argued about signatures and left with our oxen. One marvels at the audacity of the system. It's almost admirable, this unyielding belief that somewhere behind the burning churches and trampled vineyards, the bookkeeping must persist. In fact, you find a directive titled Procedures for Collection in temporarily hostile zones. It includes gems like approach with visible insignia of office, carry writs from multiple authorities, remind citizens of heavenly judgment if payment is withheld. If hostilities occur, retreat with dignity, record reasons. You raise an eyebrow at retreat with dignity. One assumes this includes not tripping over your own sandals while fleeing. Despite the absurdity, these tax rituals offered a strange kind of stability. Villages that filed even during chaos were less likely to be punished when the dust settled. A scroll from the Peloponnese recounts a village that built a small underground chamber just to store its tax ledgers. When the war ended, they emerged receipts in hand. The empire forgave half their debt in admiration of their organizational spirit. You smile at that. Leave it to the Byzantines to reward survival and clerical neatness. Even rebel rulers copied the imperial model. One short-lived usurper in Syria issued his own tax decrees, near copies of official Byzantine forms, right down to the fonts. The only difference, he stamped them with a crude seal of a lion, holding a loaf of bread. No one's sure why. Possibly hunger. You find a poetic aside buried in the scroll, clearly written by a tired scribe, caught in a burning office. The walls are smoke. The books are ash. Still we calculate. Still we count. May God tax no one more than this. There's something touching about that. Beneath the madness, the violence, the scorched fields and shifting banners, there were still people, scribes, peasants, minor officials trying to do their jobs, to add columns, to carry ones, to keep the illusion of empire alive, one goat assessment at a time. The last entry is brief, scrawled in haste, but legible. Today the rebels came. Tomorrow perhaps the emperor. Regardless, the grain must be recorded. You exhale slowly. In Byzantium, even as the world burned, the taxes lived on. You ease open the next scroll, and it hits you immediately. Lavender-scented wax, delicate script, and an elaborate header ecclesiastical accountancy, and the sacred revenue records. Oh yes, you've arrived at the Church's contribution to Byzantine taxation, the slow, reverent, and occasionally shady blend of scripture and spreadsheets. The scroll opens with an imperial proclamation. The Church shall be free of secular burdens, except where noted required or convenient to the state. A classic Byzantine hedge. And so begins a dance that would last centuries between the emperor's treasury and the Church's vaults. You already know the Church was a landowner-employer, and influence machine rolled into one incense-scented package. Monasteries owned vineyards, workshops, and herds. Bishops collected tithes. And parish churches, some barely more than wooden shacks, often held more detailed birth records than the state itself. What does this mean for taxation? You guessed it, a complicated, evolving web of exemptions, partial levies, occasional penalties, and frequent divine forgetfulness. You read a report from a provincial tax collector near Ancyra local monastery, claims exemption based on relics. Said relic was a sandal attributed to the Apostle Andrew. Sandal smells recent. Exemption granted anyway. Despite formal exemptions, monasteries often volunteered contributions, partly to keep imperial auditors at bay, partly to maintain favor, and partly because even monks couldn't avoid the persuasive power of a well-armed treasurer. Historians still argue whether the Church paid out of piety or pragmatism. Some say monastic leaders believed their wealth was best used by the empire to protect Christendom. Others suggest they simply hoped tax donations would be remembered at their judgment day. Blessed are the meek and the generously cooperative. You leaf deeper, and find a table of church-led fiscal efforts. Monasteries providing grain during droughts, bishops funding fort wall repairs, convents supplying linen to the army, one abbey that paid its entire village's taxes to prevent a riot. Of course, not all contributions were voluntary. One letter details a visit from the logothete of the treasury to a coastal monastery. His arrival, according to the monk's notes, caused much trembling. He requested access to their cellars for inventory purposes, and left with 5 amphorae of wine and a small golden icon. When questioned, he reportedly replied, "The emperor thirsts. Also his soul." The church played both sides. When it suited them, they claimed immunity under divine law. But they also administered taxation themselves. Parish priests often acted as de facto census takers. Monks compiled inventories. Some monasteries even offered notary services, issuing receipts, stamped with crosses and quotes from Scripture. One such receipt reads, "Render unto Caesar, but please record it in duplicate." Still, the line between sacred and taxable remained blurred. In some provinces, churches collected a local toll, ostensibly to maintain roads, but kept a portion for spiritual landscaping. One abbey built a series of fountains, shaped like doves. Another imported marble pews from Thessaloniki, and claimed it was an investment in heavenly acoustics. Not all went unchecked. You read a scroll detailing the investigation of a wealthy monastery accused of hoarding coin. The investigation ended abruptly. No charges filed. The inspector later entered holy orders. Coincidence, surely. There's a peculiar episode buried in these notes. A village that declared its entire populace as clergy to avoid taxation. The scheme lasted nearly 2 years. Every child wore robes. Every chicken had a saint's name. Weddings required a baptismal certificate. When the imperial inspectors finally caught on, they reportedly asked, "Which of you is not ordained?" Silence followed. The church's role in taxation also had a performative aspect. Public donations were often accompanied by bells, incense, and chanted ledgers. One bishop famously gave a speech before presenting a cartload of silver to the emperor, beginning with, "Though heaven needs no balance sheet, the earth has its debts." You find one scroll, written in the careful rounded script of a monastery accountant. It lists not just income, but penances. People who had sinned paid in coin goods or services. One man guilty of gluttony delivered 300 loaves of bread to a garrison. Another, suspected of envy, donated wool for military cloaks, a scribbled note at the bottom. "Let it be known, envy knits warm." The church's entanglement with taxes went beyond bookkeeping. It shaped policies. During major famines, bishops lobbied for reduced grain levies. During wars, monasteries acted as treasury branches, storing coin and grain. Even theological councils occasionally paused for financial audits, because heresy could wait, but the wheat report could not. Still tension simmered. You find a fiery letter from a minister complaining about a bishop's refusal to hand over land revenue. The bishop's reply, a detailed theological argument involving Leviticus martyrdom and an obscure miracle involving invisible taxes. The matter was settled with a handshake, a relic exchange, and a slightly higher voluntary donation from the bishop's estate. The final entry is almost too perfect. A list of monasteries sorted by contribution tier. Tier 1, major supporters of imperial finance. Tier 2, inconsistent givers. Tier 3, holy but unhelpful. Beside Tier 3 is an angry doodle of a monk throwing a scroll out a window. You smile. For all its sanctity, the church was a player in the fiscal game. Revered and resented exempt and essential, it walked the same tightrope as everyone else, just with better robes. You blow gently across the top of the scroll. A cloud of lavender dust rises, and you swear it smells faintly of quiet judgment. Somewhere, a monk is still double-checking ledgers by candlelight, muttering psalms as he adjusts for depreciation on his sacred olive grove. The final scroll waits for you like a patient cat, curled up unimpressed and daring you to touch it. You do. Carefully. It's thinner than the others, less formal perhaps, written with a sigh rather than a decree. Its title, Petitions Appeals, and the elusive dream of a Byzantine tax refund. You already know this one's going to hurt. The Byzantine Empire, for all its efficiency and ritual, was notoriously slow to give anything back, especially taxes. Refunds existed technically. In practice, getting one was the bureaucratic equivalent of climbing a cliff made of wax, with no shoes. In the rain, you begin with a petition from a widow in Chaltis. She had overpaid her land tax after misreading a decree involving secondary yield declarations. She filed a refund request, attached a notarized copy of her payment, and even had her parish priest sign an affidavit. The request was passed up the chain, and up, and up. She died 42 years later. Her great-granddaughter filed a follow-up. The final note on the document reads, "Awaiting verification of initial overpayment. Clerks deceased. Ink faded. Appeal pending." That's somehow impressive. You flip to a scroll containing various appeals. The handwriting changes with each one, different voices across time, all asking the same thing, please. Just this once. Can I get my money back? A shopkeeper in Nicaea writes, "I was taxed twice due to a duplication error. My cousin, also named Nikitas, is the true taxpayer. I have enclosed proof, a sworn testimony, and a drawing of Nikitas's bad haircut. The response confirmed error. Funds were remitted to district office. District office closed due to fire. Funds relocated to temporary treasury. Location unknown. Request resubmitted." You rub your temples. Byzantine taxation wasn't built for reversals. It was a one-way street uphill with toll booths spaced every few meters. The idea of someone giving back money to a peasant or merchant was uncomfortable, against the rhythm of the empire itself. Still, people tried. Appeals were common. You read one from a farmer who had lost his oxen in a landslide just days after delivering his grain tax. His letter is heartbreakingly polite. "The emperor's need is greater than mine, but if the grain might be returned so my sons can eat, I would be grateful." The response none recorded, just a blank space. You stare at it longer than you should. Historians still argue whether refunds were truly that rare, or simply undocumented when they happened. There are anecdotal accounts of coins being returned, goods being replaced, even compensations being offered after raids. But these were exceptions. Most refund requests were routed into the labyrinth of Byzantine administration, redirected, reconsidered, lost, or placed under review. One scribe's note reads, "Citizen informed of appeal delay. Offered spiritual comfort in lieu of reimbursement. That's bureaucracy and piety in a single dagger stroke." You read a final list, a ledger of deferred tax resolutions. Each entry has a name date amount and status. The statuses are grimly familiar: awaiting confirmation, pending reassessment, office dissolved, monastery assumed jurisdiction, petitioner deceased issue, unresolved, and yet a handful read approved. Compensation issued. You blink. Proof. Miracles happened even in the tax office. There's a small addendum from a clerk 3 refunds granted last year. Coin dispersed with ceremony. Recipients confused, grateful, deeply suspicious. One elderly man, upon receiving his returned overpayment, reportedly said, "I thought this was a test, or a trick." I kept the coin, but I haven't slept since. You close the scroll gently, almost affectionately. After everything after the boots, the barley, the duplicated chickens, the church exemptions, the armed convoys and smug bishops, this is what lingers, the quiet, endless hope that maybe, just maybe, the system might blink, might soften, might give something back, even if it takes a generation. You imagine a scribe copying a refund note by flickering candlelight, whispering to himself, "May this coin find its way home." And perhaps it does. Now the scrolls are all closed. The candlelight has shrunk to a quiet golden heartbeat on the table beside you, and the shadows have stretched out into soft blankets across the walls. Outside, Constantinople dreams its dreams of marble incense and the quiet churn of waves against the harbor. Somewhere, a clerk snores into a ledger. A donkey sighs into its hay. The empire, so grand, so fractured, so wildly obsessed with counting, everything rests for the night. You've walked with it through 1,000 dusty offices, trudged through wet villages, with tax farmers skimmed angry notes and smudged doodles, traced the fates of oxen and saints and stubborn goats. You've seen the gears behind the golden mosaics, the lists behind the litanies, and the stubborn heartbeat of bureaucracy that outlived even emperors. And now you can let it all go. No more grain tallies. No more receipts scrawled on goatskin. No more dreams of refunds that never quite arrive. Just the quiet hum of a tired empire and the gentle sound of ink drying where no one will read it. Let your shoulders sink. Let your breath slow. Maybe tomorrow you'll write your own scroll, a short one. Just a list of things you didn't do. Things no one taxed you for. Things like sleeping in, smiling at nothing, dreaming of silence. Because tonight, you've paid enough. And for once, there's nothing left to file.